All right, and welcome back. And this is our last unit. Who would have thought? We've covered all 7 of the Catholic sacraments in this course so far. We've looked at what sacraments are: the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, anointing of sick, reconciliation, marriage, matrimony, and holy orders. We've also looked at other themes such as the Holy Spirit and vocations. And now we're going to move into kind of this last little section, which is a mini section on morality. So the reason why we look at morality is this idea that, well, the sacraments and living the sacraments call us to a relationship with God. And that's going to call us to a certain way of life. And really what morality is not simply right and wrong or rules. Morality is a relationship. Morality is about living in a relationship with God and discovering through God what we should do and who we should be to find eternal happiness, to find fulfillment in life. Everyone's trying to see, what do I have to do in life? Who do I have to be to find happiness? And we're getting pulled in all these different directions, or being told all these different things, and I have to do this, and I have to do that, and I have to do this, and be this, and get this, and make this much money, and do that, in order to be happy and successful. Well, God gives us a very different message in that regard, which is simply to be in a relationship with Him and others and to live His commandments of love. And if we do that, it doesn't matter what our job is, it doesn't matter what we accomplish in life, it doesn't matter our level of education. As long as we do those, we have everything. So this little section is going to look at that idea of morality and how we can live a moral life because we lived a sacramental life. And we're going to start in this first module looking at kind of a very major concept of morality, of conscience. So what is conscience, and how can we use conscience to live that moral life? So first, let's look at what conscience is. A lot of times there's a lot of different things to be said about what conscience is, and conscience sounds like such a far-fetched idea, or such a, well, how do you put your words on conscience? We'll look at a second what conscience is not. But conscience, if you think of the word with knowledge from the original Latin, or akin to the word consciousness, it's really going to be about becoming conscious of God's presence in our very selves. So the Catechism is going to talk about how the conscience is hearing God's voice, saying what we ought to be and do. Now, this isn't a literal voice, even though God can communicate if He so chooses through a literal voice. It's not a literal voice. If you're hearing literal voices in your head, you might want to speak to someone else. But this is hearing, when we say the word voice, is hearing God communicate to us in the depths of our being. Well, how does God communicate with us? Well, if God is not simply this old man in the sky. It's not a Catholic understanding of God. God is Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, omnipotent and omnipresent, the unmoved mover, that from which all existence is contingent upon, and that who put all existence into motion. That's a lot grander and much goes beyond much more the physical bounds of existence when we're talking about God. So therefore, if God is not bound by time and space, if God is not bound by the physicality of this world, it also reasons to say that God is going to not simply communicate in human terms. We're so used to the way I'm communicating with you through words and sentences, etc., and verbally. But God is going to God's communication is going to transcend verbal communication. Perhaps it could be in giving a sense of peace. It could be in our emotions, for instance. It could be in a moment. It could be through another person. It could be verbally. But we're going to see how can we become attuned, aware to God's presence in the depths of our soul, to God's voice of peace, quite frankly, and through that peace speaking to us, or through those nudges and those tugs. And we might use as metaphors for conscience, speak with us. Conscience is also very much a process. So it's hearing God's communication to us about something, and then we use that to make an informed judgment of reason. So conscience isn't just a moment, so much as it is a process of conscience. In that regard, we refer to conscience as a faculty. The idea of conscience as hearing God's voice, that depths of our soul, and then by acting upon it, making a decision to distinguish what we should and what we shouldn't do. So in many ways, we can see conscience as an invitation from God, really the core of our relationship with God, where we hear God's voice and act upon it. So what is conscience not? Conscience is not simply a majority opinion. So our conscience is not simply, I'm just going to go with what everyone else says, and I'm going to go with what the majority of society says is right, and what people tell me I should do. That's not conscience. Conscience is between us and God. It's not just a feeling. Sometimes we think, I'm going to do whatever I feel is right, or whatever feels right in this moment. Feelings are fickle. I mean, if we just based everything we ever wanted to do on a feeling, we'd be pretty flaky people. I don't know about you, but my emotions change all the time. If I just always did what I felt like, I probably wouldn't have a job. I probably wouldn't have a family. I'd probably be a bum, or more so than I am. So we can't just simply, while emotions are a good starting point for understanding where we are and having self-awareness, they're not really ultimately the basis for good decision making, because they're kind of flaky in many regards. Superego. So this is, if you ever heard of the psychologist Freud, the ego, id, and superego. This is referring to this idea of a superimposed conscience. So the idea of just doing something because someone else is telling you to, or you have your mom in the back of your mind telling you what to do, and you have basically her ego or her conscience as directing you. Our conscience is unique to ourselves, and we have to inform our own conscience. We can't have someone else be our conscience. Likewise, the church is not even our conscience. The church has a responsibility to guide and to help us mold our conscience, and as a source of our conscience, but the church cannot replace our conscience. The church is very clear to that in its moral teachings. That's been reaffirmed in Pope Francis' encyclical Amoris Laetitia, that the church's role is to journey with individuals in conscience formation, not superimpose its own will on someone's conscience. Likewise, conscience isn't a gut reaction. I'm going to just go with my gut. Again, all these physical indicators, feelings, and gut reactions can be indicators of developing a self-awareness, but they're ultimately not the awareness of God's presence. They're ultimately not an awareness of God's voice. Well, how do I know if God's communicating with me? It honestly takes a great deal of developing a prayer life. The more that we try to get better at communicating with God, the more we get better at hearing God, at listening to God. So many ways to better hear conscience and develop it as that moment of encounter with God, where we meet God and hear God, we have to get better at listening, and we have to get better at prayer, quite frankly. It's not Jiminy Cricket. If you ever heard Jiminy Cricket, that little cricket that tells you what to do, we might think of the angel and the demon on the shoulder. We think of, from Emperor's New Groove, Kronk's conscience. That is also not conscience. So conscience is not this separate entity from ourselves. It's not someone else. Well, the angel told me to do it, or Jiminy Cricket told me to do it. It's not something separate from ourselves. Rather, again, it's that meeting point in the depths of our soul where we hear God communicating to us, and then based on that, we make a decision, a process, an informed process of reason. Conscience is also not a myth. So some people might say, conscience is just something people make up to make you feel bad about your decision. You should just do whatever the heck you want. So in reality, we do have freedom. So yes, we do have the ability to do whatever we want. I could take, the Gatorade bottle right next to me and throw it at my screen right now. I could just decide from the beginning of the class that I was just going to give everyone an F or everyone an A. I mean, we have the ability to do that. Now, with freedom comes responsibility. I can do a lot of different things, but there's going to be repercussions. I throw the Gatorade bottle at my computer. I could ruin my computer. If I do not, grade properly, then there could be repercussions for that as a teacher. So part of it is, a lot of times when we say I'm just going to do whatever I want, we're kind of being ignorant or ignoring the fact that, well, whether we believe in religion or not, actions have natural consequences. And so we can do whatever we want, but we're going to have to own up to it. So the idea of conscience as a myth isn't true, because we can understand through what we call the natural law. So what we can understand about truth and goodness and God, just simply through reason and experience, that there is a natural sense of good and wrong in the world. You might have a different understanding of what a good day is, and I may have a certain understanding of a good day. But the fact that we both have an understanding of what a good day entails means that there is such a thing as a good day. So there is an ultimate truth. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So ultimately, there is an ultimate sense of good and evil in the world. So our conscience, by hearing God's voice and making a judgment on it, helps us to understand what that is. So to guide us, we talk about freedom. To guide us, there's going to be some different rules or guidelines to help us in our freedom. So I like to use the analogy of a bowling alley. If you've ever gone bowling, there you have yourself and the ball, which is your life. You have the lane, I'm sorry, you and the bowling ball are you, and the lane is your life. And then the pins is our end goal is heaven. And so what happens if you don't, shoot or throw the ball in straight and narrow and end up in the lane? Well, you end up in the gutter. It's a quite interesting literal moral imagery. So what might we put in to prevent us from falling in the gutter? Bumpers. So rules and laws, their purpose are meant to be those bumpers, not to constrain us, but really to be free. Think about an intersection, a busy intersection in your nearby town. Can you imagine that intersection without any traffic lights, with any stop signs or any traffic signals? I mean, there could be a lot of accidents. So the fact that, for example, we have traffic laws are really meant to free us. That way when we're driving, we're not worrying about if this person's going to stop or not. I mean, we still have to be a defensive driver because people still disobey laws. But if everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing, then it frees us up to drive. So in the same way, good and just laws are not meant to constrict. They're meant to free us up. But it comes from an understanding of relationship. Our relationship to society is to seek the common good, to support one another and helping each other reach happiness. Our relationship with God is to love God above all else, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Any rules or laws that come from that serve the purpose of that relationship, if you will. So these rules help us to do that as well. So we have two principles of conscience from St. Thomas Aquinas. The first rule is we have to always inform our conscience. Conscience formation is a never-ending process. You're going to keep doing it till the day we die. So it's our responsibility to not just turn to the sources we want to hear from, but really turn to all sources and the right sources to help inform our conscience. Then once we've informed it, and we've done the best job of informing it, Aquinas says that we have to follow it. So to properly inform our conscience and to not follow it is actually to sin, according to Aquinas. So what are some rules that can help us, guide us, and do that? Well, first we might think of the golden rule, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to treat others the way we like to be treated. We might think of the rule of the ends don't justify the means. So even if we end up with a good result, the way we got there does not justify the good result. So if we had to do some pretty bad or evil or sinful things to get to that good result, it doesn't justify it. And lastly, we have to respond to others with love and charity, and we have to respect each other's conscience. So each of us has a right to a conscience. We have a right to hear God's voice and to make our own practical judgments of reasons. And so we cannot impose our conscience on another individual. So what might be some pitfalls to conscience? The Venerable Fulton J. Sheen's famous phrase, moral principles do not depend on a majority vote. Wrong is wrong even if everyone is wrong. Right is right even if no one is right. That there's ultimately this ultimate truth. So if we fail to inform our conscience, or we don't properly form it, we may have what's called an erroneous conscience. An erroneous conscience comes from mainly two sources. It comes from ignorance, basically not knowing any better. So we didn't know better, we didn't know what was right, so we couldn't do what was right. So we couldn't choose what was right. Or insincerity, which I think is quite frankly the most common sense of an erroneous conscience, where, we knew the right thing to do, we knew where to look, but we just didn't because we didn't want to have to hear the answer. And that's a really difficult thing. A lot of times, how many of us will harp on this question? We have this question we always want to ask, and the question that continually again and again, that our whole worldview even depends on this question. And then someone gives us an answer that's reasonable, but we don't want to hear the answer because that would mean we have to change how we think. If we're seeking truth, if we're seeking goodness, if we're seeking to grow, we have to be open to answers. If we're simply asking a question to ask a question and to argue for argument's sake, that doesn't benefit anyone. That doesn't grow. That doesn't show maturity, quite frankly. It's just someone who just wants to do what they want and not have to have responsibility. So part of it is we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be humble enough to make sure we're making a good effort to actually learn and inform our conscience. One of the ways that fails this is this idea of relativism. This idea, well, there's no truth, there's no absolute, it's just everyone's opinion. Let me say this, we're all entitled to an opinion, we're all entitled to a perspective, but quite frankly, to say that it's just all opinion, it's a cop-out. Instead of actually dealing with an issue, we just say, it's your opinion, it's my opinion, and then nothing happens, we never deal with it. But relativism is self-refuting. To say that there is no truth is self-refuting. It's an oxymoron. Because when you say there are no truths and no absolutes, you are declaring a truth. You are declaring the truth that there is no truth. It doesn't work. So this idea, a lot of times we're given in society today, this idea of relativism that, truth is whatever you make it, is simply not true. No pun intended. So I kind of use the example before of a good day. The reality is there are general truths in this world that we can come to know, of goodness, of beauty, that we can come to know that certain things are real from our own reason and logic. Now, we might all have different perspectives on it. So your perspective on a good day might be different than my perspective on a good day. But rather than simply saying it's just opinion, how can we take your perspective, my perspective, other people's perspectives, and join them together to discover what truth is? That's productive. That actually goes somewhere. It actually produces a result. And so we have to be careful that that's what we're doing, that we're bringing people's perspectives together to discover truth, as opposed to simply say truth doesn't exist because we don't want to have to deal with truth. We don't have to deal with the consequences and having to amend our lives in a certain way and have that responsibility. So we're going to see this tension, this balance between this objective sense of morality, what we can know, and a subjective sense of morality, our perspectives. And we need both together to discover what truth is so that we can work towards goodness and right. I guarantee you, if you look at society today, any of the problems we have, any of the sins we struggle with as a society, any of the injustices we have, it comes from a sense of apathy and relativism where we fail to see what is true here, what is true, what is good, what is right, and how can we work towards it. We do that, I guarantee you we can work towards overcoming a lot of the struggles and issues we have as a society where we fail to love one another. So how do we inform conscience? When we talk about conscience, we might talk about dictates or principles on which we can base our conscience on, that demand something of us. So when we feel that tug in our conscience, we might say that our conscience is demanding something of us. So things that might lead to poor dictates and an erroneous conscience. I think of the bad examples of others. If all we've known are the examples and the role models of others that are probably not doing some pretty good things, then we might lead to thinking that that's okay. Vices and sins, so negative habits and the failure to love others, again, may build up together and compound on each other and keep us from doing what's right. When I think inordinate attachment to desire, so when we let our emotions take hold of us. I mean, really, when we're attached to instant gratification, that's really an addiction. A lot of times we think of addiction as, drugs and alcohol. But we can be addicted to attention. We can be addicted to gossip. We can be addicted to instant gratification. So when we're actually addicted to those feelings, we're actually not free. Because those addictions to those feelings keep us from actually thinking clearly. If you've ever been in one of those relationships where you know you should end it, but you're afraid of being alone or you're afraid of ending it, or that feeling keeps you from being free and perhaps may keep you in an unhealthy relationship. This idea of false autonomy, we've kind of spoken before. I am my own law, I decide what's right. Ultimately, it's more of a selfish outlook rather than discovering truth. Sometimes it's good to be proven wrong because you grow that way. To build muscle, we rip muscles. Sometimes it takes that humility to discover truth. So simply ignore it doesn't really help anyone grow. It actually shows a moral immaturity. Lack of love and repentance. So when we fail to want to love others and be other-centered, or we never want to apologize, I never do anything wrong, it's always everyone else's fault. Again, it shows kind of an immoral immaturity. And ultimately, we're going to believe that Christ is going to reveal to us the fullness of who God the Father is and of truth. So not fully knowing Christ, the gospel, and church's teachings, it might not help us in always informing our conscience the best. Likewise, if we practice virtue, so we develop these good habits, then we can be able to always, in that moment of needing to make a practical judgment of reason, we can already be geared towards doing what's right because we've already been practicing it. The gifts of the Holy Spirit that we talked about in the third unit, gifts of wisdom, understanding, knowledge, fortitude, counsel, piety, fear of the Lord, these supernatural gifts that will help us configure ourselves to be able to hear God more clearly. Just laws, norms, reason. So the norms or principles that laws may be based upon. So just because a law exists doesn't automatically make it moral or just. Laws can be unjust. Don't forget that for years in our own country, slavery was legal. That was an unjust law. So by no means am I saying disobey the law. The vast majority of laws tend to be just and moral, but that does not automatically mean that every law is just or moral. So we need to make sure we're turning to just laws, that laws are reasonable for the common good, that from people who have the authority to do so, and uphold the norms of natural law that God has revealed what is true and good. Of course, following Christ, the Gospels and the Church's teachings, we believe Christ, again, is the fullest revelation of the Father and of truth. Jesus said, I am not an opinion, but he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So how can we turn to Christ for truth? And honestly, the experience of people with informed consciences. So on the other hand, people with good consciences, who are good role models, who seek to do what is right and good and just, how can we learn from them? The saints, for example, are a great example of people with informed consciences. So what does this law talk about? We've talked about law a little bit before. So when we can turn to different laws, this is not the only part of morality, but we turn to different laws. Ultimately, all laws is rooted in eternal law. So eternal law is those ordinances, those principles by which God holds all of existence together. We can come to know that in two ways. The natural law, which is simply by being human, by being rational human beings, having a mind, a reason, and logic and experience, we can come to know that. So someone could never hear the gospel, never know anything about God, and still come to learn that there is such a thing as right and wrong in the world, that there are certain things I should do, and that there are certain things that I should avoid. Likewise, there is revealed law. So there are naturally things that were revealed through Christ. And some of these were revealed through the Old Testament, and we call the Old Law, so through the prophets and through Moses and through the Hebrew Scriptures, and the New Law, what Jesus revealed through the Gospels and his teachings. Ultimately, a lot of what was in the new law is going to be translated into what we call canon law or church law, so the law that governs the governance of the church. Likewise, the natural law, what we can discover to be true and good about existence from our own reason, is going to be translated into civil law. So every civil law is going to be based on something of natural law. So, for example, the idea of don't drink and drive is a civil law. It's going to be based on an understanding of natural law. Well, I should probably take care of other people and not hurt others. And if I drink and drive, I'm risking that. So we created a civil law that's going to enshrine in our law and our society that which we reasonably could understand to take care of others and not hurt others. I wanted to focus in on a second on this idea of new law and old law, which is part of Jesus' teaching. So if we turn to Jesus as a main focal point in informing our conscience, good role models, who's a better model than Jesus, who is God, who came to show us how to live? Jesus came to remind us what the real purpose of action is. So law is going to help us to tell us how we should act. So law tells us what we can and cannot do. Morality tells us what we should and should not do. And Jesus came at a time where we had this old law. So Jesus did not come to abolish the old law, but he came to fulfill it. And so in the old law, this was a law at the time in that were practiced by Judaism. He says there are different rules or laws that you might be practicing. For example, don't kill, don't commit adultery. If you need a divorce, your wife will give a bill of divorce. Don't make a false oath. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, Hammurabi's code. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. We might call this an external observance of the law. So I'm following in my action. Don't kill, don't commit adultery. An eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. I'm looking at my actions. Jesus says, before you start trying to figure out what to do, check yourself, check your heart, check your attitudes. Make sure that your heart and your mind is in the right place. Because if your heart and your mind isn't in the right place, it doesn't matter what laws there are. We might not see the value in them, so we're not going to want to do them. But rather, change your heart. Don't just worry about not just killing anyone. Also, don't worry about not holding on to anger. If we hold on to anger and grudges, we're really hurting relationships, and we're probably killing our relationship before we ever even take someone's life. Don't just not commit adultery. Don't look at someone else as an object that with lust. I just want to use someone for my own gratification. Because once we've done that, we've already lowered their sense of humanity. We don't see them as a person. We see them as an object. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience, but when someone's being used, they know it. They know that that person doesn't genuinely love them. They just want to use them for their own goal, and when they're done, they leave. And so Jesus says, make sure your heart is seeing someone as a person worthy of love. Jesus, whoever divorces his wife commits adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This kind of goes back to what we talked about a couple modules ago in marriage. It's the idea of marriage as a covenant, to not just see marriage as something fickle. It also was, unfortunately, women had the lower hand in marriage at the time. Oftentimes divorces would be given by men. Unless a woman had a lot of money, they were kind of short-ended of the stick. So Jesus is also saying, don't abuse marriage. Marriage isn't just something for your personal gain that you just might abuse and use the other spouse and then say, oh, I'm going to divorce them. Be honest and committed to what you're entering into. But of course, again, this idea of annulments and whether marriage is unlawful is something different. Of course, we spoke in that module also of the church's pastoral teaching to those who might find themselves in a divorce. When Jesus says, don't just take a false oath, but let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Don't swear at all. Basically means I should have to take an oath for you to believe me. You should know that what I say is true just because I'm a genuine person. Offer no resistance to one who is evil, but if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one to him as well. Essentially, don't not defend yourself within reason, but don't seek revenge. All right, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth makes the whole world go blind. Gandhi said that. A lot of individuals are attributed as saying that. If we simply seek revenge, we never seek peace, we never seek love, we never find reconciliation. And lastly, don't just love your neighbor, love your enemy. That's the hard part of Christianity. That Jesus, is much more than just be a good person. Notice Jesus never said in the Gospels, all you need to be my followers to be a good person, but rather love others, including your enemies. Why? Because Christ came to bring redemption and love to all. He said, if you only love those who love you, there's no benefit in that. But if we love those who hate us, we have a chance to change their hearts by the way that we love them. The whole idea of kill them with kindness, the idea of love even those who don't love us in return. So we see in Jesus teaching this idea of an internal observance. First, embrace the value of God's law in our hearts before we start to try to act it out. If we can do that, what we're really doing is we're embracing truth and goodness in our conscience, and then making a judgment to carry out on the outside, externally. What's something else that might help us in forming conscience? We might think of virtues. We talk about good habits. We already talked about faith, hope, and love in baptism, how we can develop a trust in God, a belief in God, an expectation of what God has promised, willing to do good for others. How can we also practice what's called the cardinal virtues? So prudence, choosing responsibly. Justice, giving someone what they deserve. Fortitude, having the courage to always do what's right. Temperance, having moderation and self-control. These are habits, and we develop them by every single day. All right, I'm just going to always try to do my best to choose responsibly. I'm going to always do my best to try to give people what they deserve. I'm going to always do my best to be courageous in doing what's right. I'm going to always do my best to have some kind of self-control and not be controlled by, say, instant gratification. I'll try to do my best to love others, to not give up in despair, to trust in God and put Him first. If we can develop that, it's like riding a bike. If we can develop that day in and day out, then it'll help us to counteract different vices. So instead of being prideful, where I'm going to just focus on me, this is different than taking pride in someone's work. So it's kind of this inordinate desire of self-love, putting someone first. I'm above others. Ultimately, all sin comes from the fact of I think I know better than God and everyone else. How can we instead have faith? Instead of being jealous or resentment of what others have, to have hope that, perhaps they have this success that's going to help in the future, and God will also help me to get to where I need to go. Instead of lusting after someone and seeing someone as an object to be used, rather to love them and see them as a person. Instead of being greedy and trying to get whatever we want, instead of trying to dominate the world's resources, when we keep resources from one another, especially from the poor, we're stealing from them. We don't own the world. The world was given to us as a gift from God. Instead of being greedy about just materialism, how can we be responsible in our choosing about what we really need? Instead of being angry and lashing out at others and acting out in wrath, how can we try to see what other people truly deserve and treat them with that respect? Rather than dealing with sloth or apathy or not caring or I don't care. A lot of times that keeps us from doing what's right, from actually changing someone's life. If there's anything that keeps us from doing good and changing the world, it's not caring enough to do it. How can we instead have the courage to stand up when no one else will? How can we, instead of over-consuming our goods in gluttony, over-consuming food, over-consuming a drink, and not, how can we instead have some moderation instead of dealing in with gluttony? So when we think of greed, of materialism, gluttony, we might think of over-consuming. How can we instead have some moderation and self-control? Lastly, how do we put all this together? Well, one kind of acronym we can use in making decisions of how that second part of conscience, when we hear God's voice, then make a practical judgment of reason. One of the ways we can make that practical judgment of reason is using what's called the SEER model. Study, elect, execute, and review. So study. So first, everything we just talked about, how can we learn as much as we can about all that? Virtues, Christ's laws, Christ's teachings, the church, what conscience is, what conscience isn't, freedom, responsibility. How can we take all these different things and continually learn about them and learn even more again and again and again? So we're always studying. And then we take that information that we've learned and then we pray about it. We discern. Discern is about a process about making a decision through prayer and reflection. And we kind of step out. So maybe we're in the situation where it's noisy in different ways. Society can be very loud, and so we have to kind of step out to step back in. We step out to discern, to look at everything with the gift of understanding, right? The gift of wisdom, to understand something's value and how it fits in the bigger picture, to take consideration everything we've learned. And then we make a decision based on prayer and reflection. We might turn to other individuals for counseling in that electing. And then we execute. We carry out what we actually chose. And that can be really hard because we might not know what the right thing is to do. We might know what to do, but then we may not have the strength to do it because we're afraid. We're afraid of what people are going to think, what people are going to say. Instead, use the virtue and the gift of fortitude, to have the courage. Fortitude is what gives us the courage to actually carry out what we decided to do. And then afterwards, review, examine our conscience, remember for reconciliation. Think back, what did I do well? What did I not do well? At the St. Ignatius Loyola would always encourage individuals to pray the examen at the end of each day, to examine our day, what happened, where was God with me today, where did I fail to love. And if we actually do that practice regularly, it can be very beneficial because then we can take what we learn and apply it back to S in a full circular way, bring it back to study. So we're always studying, we're always electing, we're always executing, but we always should be reviewing so we can learn from our past decisions. So that's kind of the general overview of conscience, this module, but that is conscience. There's a lot with it, and morality and basis for it. So I encourage you now to go forward to the rest of the materials in our module, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. But other than that, have a good one.